So listen, I don't want to be doom and gloom. I really don't. But believing in Jesus can be hard. Like my whole life, I was raised in the church. I've been raised in the church for the last 23 years. I was baptized when I was 12. So, for the last 23 years, I've been a committed Christian. But, and I love I love church. I love being a Christian. Jesus and the teachings of Jesus have, really captivated me my entire life. And, I love following Jesus, right? But it's sometimes it's so hard. Like, here's what I mean. So, I want to believe in Jesus, but then there's that whole thing about turning the other cheek. And where Jesus says, hey, if somebody hurts you, you are responsible to purposely not hurt them back. And in fact, that turn the other cheek things means present yourself in a non-violent, resisting way to show them the error of their ways by allowing them to hurt you further if they so choose. Really? I'm not trying to question Jesus, but that seems like not plan A. Like maybe plan D after we try some other stuff first. Right? It's hard, but so that's not, the only way, I referenced it during the communion thing, that there's this one time where Jesus says, he didn't come to bring peace to everyone in every situation. Instead, he said that he would, sort of like with a sword, divide people, right? Like we have to make a choice about Jesus. So he says, he actually says the words, hey, if you're not willing to leave your mother and father, you're not worthy of my kingdom. And he never said oh, psych. I was just kidding. That was hyperbole for a point. He doesn't say that. He just says no, you have to literally leave your parents to follow me. If they don't believe in me, you've got to believe in me and forget them. I mean, and again, I'd say maybe it's hyperbole. There's the hand cutting off thing that he says, that's clearly hyperbole. But we know that the disciples did exactly the leaving their families and leaving their parents and leaving their culture thing to follow Jesus. We know that they did. And that, that is just exceedingly difficult. And then there's probably the hardest thing is, Jesus says we should forgive people. And boy, is he serious about that. Because Jesus says, you got to forgive everybody at every circumstance, everywhere you go, anytime. There are no exceptions. There's not but what about this? What about this doesn't exist in Jesus' world? Jesus just says, you are forgiven by me, therefore, as a forgiven person, you are expected to forgive other people. And guys, it's really hard. It's hard to believe in the Jesus who doesn't like an eye for an eye. It's really hard to believe in the Jesus who says you may have to break from the most important people in your life. It's really hard to believe in Jesus who says you're not allowed to hold on to a grudge for the rest of your life, even when they really did a bad thing. That is so hard. And please hear me. I want to believe in Jesus. I want to believe in the Jesus with all of those things involved. To be fair, I actually would prefer to believe in the Jesus with those things eliminated. But that's not an option. So in lieu of just, removing the tough stuff, I want to believe in Jesus. But it's so, so hard. And it just takes so much. And so honestly, I think at the end of the day, I desperately need help. And that means that there's a guy in the Bible that I can relate to more than anybody else. This is what happened. One day, Jesus was off on a camping trip with his 3 closest disciples. A really amazing thing happened. We talked about that in, I think, our last sermon series. Well, while Jesus and his closest disciples are off on this camping trip doing stuff, the other disciples are back home, and they're trying to do what they're supposed to do, which is do Jesus' ministry. They're trying to teach, they're trying to preach, they're trying to heal, they're trying to, feed people, they're trying to do all the stuff that Jesus told them and taught them they were supposed to do. So when Jesus comes back home from his camping trip, he finds his disciples doing ministry, which is great. And had he shown up at any other time throughout the weekend, I bet he would have seen his disciples doing wonderful things, and it would have been great. But when Jesus shows up at this point, that's not what it is. You see, there was this little boy who was possessed by a demon. That particular demon was particularly destructive and harmful, and would make the kid foam at the mouth and go stiff as a board, and the kid gets thrown into the water, and he's going to drown, or thrown in a fire and he's going to burn, and just terrible situation. And so the father of this child brings the boy to Jesus' disciples. He's heard, hey, your teacher, your rabbi can heal people. I hear you're also in the healing business. What can you do with my child? And the disciples, the 9 of them who did not go on the camping trip, they did their best. They prayed and they put their hands on him and they did everything they could to heal the child, and it really only seemed to make the child worse. Like, it wasn't just that they weren't healing the child, it was that the child was being made worse through the efforts of the disciples, which is not what you want to do when you're trying to heal somebody. And so Jesus shows up. And he arrives on a scene where this little boy is, convulsing and being in the throes of demonic possession. His disciples are trying to do what they can, but because of their failure, they're drawing a crowd. Nobody ever cares if you do something good, but you fail a little bit, everybody comes out the woodwork to check you out. And so there's this big crowd of people that's gathered around. Some of the people in the crowd are religious leaders who are now mocking the disciples and saying, oh, you don't want to follow us, you want to follow Jesus. Look how good that's doing. They're mocking, they're kind of like egging on the crowd. And Jesus shows up into what can only really be described as like a circus. And he's trying to get to the bottom of what's happening. And he finds the father of the little boy. And this is what he asks the father about what's going on. It's in the Gospel according to Mark, and this is what we read. How long has this been happening? Jesus asked the boy's father. He replied, since he was a little boy. The spirit often throws him into the fire or into water, trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can. What do you mean, if I can? Jesus asked. Anything is possible if a person believes. The father instantly cried out, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. Now listen, I'm going to defend this father, okay? I'm not a parent myself, but I've been given to understand that if you are a parent, the most important thing in your life is your children, right? I've been given that's the understand, I've been told that. So, assuming that that's true, this child is the most important thing in his life. The most important thing in his life is this child, and this child is suffering. And this child can get no help. I mean, this would have been he says, how long has it been happening since he was a little boy? I mean, this has been going on for years. This has been going on forever. No one's ever been able to help. Again, I'm not a parent, but I've been given to understand that if you are a parent and you're unable to help your children, you feel somewhat helpless. So he would have felt, helpless, unable to, do anything for his child. That would have been going on forever. Additionally, he brought the little boy to Jesus' disciples. Jesus' disciples completely failed at helping him. And now you've got religious leaders who, to this guy, he can't tell the difference between, a Pharisee and a Jesus. They're all just religious guys to him. And nothing's helping. Is saying, if you could help, that'd be swell, is about the most faith a person can muster. It is reasonable that he would have that response to Jesus. But Jesus doesn't like it. Jesus is looking for someone who just believes. And so he asks, I want to believe. I want to get this stuff. I want to turn the other cheek. I want to forgive everybody. I want to be willing to leave anything for Jesus, but I need help with my unbelief. Man, I can relate to that guy a whole lot. I think, though, that while I want to really just focus on myself with this, because I don't want to be presumptuous. I think that there is a truth about this guy that is universal. I think that this struggle to believe, this being, as people, sitting in a place somewhere between faith and doubt and conviction and, questioning and trusting and, just saying, I just can't, I got to do it on my own. I think that that's a spot that we all sit in. If not most of the time, then, much of the time in our lives. And I'm not saying that to be insulting to anyone. Sometimes when I say these things, people are, well, it's not me. Well, maybe not you. If that's not you, you can, play on your phone. Have at it. But I think that there's a universal nature to this. And I say that because it's not just this one guy in the Bible, in the ministry of Jesus who seems to say this. But it's actually somebody that we are told in both the Old Testament and the New Testament is an example for us. Someone that's held up as a light and a shining beacon for, what we should aspire to. And I do mean that to mean that there's somebody in the Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, who is called a person after God's own heart. And he struggled with this exact same thing. And he struggled with it, not just in the places you probably know that I wouldn't talk about in a children's church setting, but in fact, he struggled with it as well in a story that we would talk about in a children's church setting. In fact, maybe the most famous children's church story of all. That means I got to talk about Goliath. So, there once was a guy named Goliath. We say Goliath was a giant, but I think he was just a really big dude. He was 9 feet 9 inches tall, almost the height of a basketball goal. He was 9'9". If he was wearing a hat, he would, hit the rim. We don't know exactly how much he weighed, but we know basically just with the way that human beings are built, that if he never lifted a day in his life, he was pushing 600 pounds. But we also know, because we know how guys are, that Goliath lifted. He was getting those gains. So I think we can safely say Goliath somewhere between 650 and 700 pounds of pure muscle. Okay? He wore like chainmail armor, like you see at the Renaissance festivals, that was 125 pounds, which, as it turns out, is exactly what I weighed as a junior in high school. Before I discovered working at Subway and making $5.15 an hour had a perk of just eating footlongs every day. And that's why I'm not 125 anymore. But me as a junior in armor on top of him. And then we're told that he has this spear tip, this iron tip on the end of his spear that is 15 pounds, which, that's roughly the same weight of that bowling ball that's always sitting at the bowling alley because no one wants it. That's on the end. By the way, how big was the wood part of that spear to hold that? That boggles the imagination. 15 pounds is a lot of pounds on the end of a stick. But that's Goliath. He's terrifying. And he was a Philistine, which means he was, part of the greatest enemies, at least in his period of time, the greatest enemies of the people of Israel. He was the champion, because of course he was. So he was the champion of the army of the Philistines. And they were at war with each other. And Goliath, I think, comes up with just a swell idea. Goliath wants to limit the bloodshed. He wants to limit the people who have to die. He wants to just, bring this all, let's just get this over with. He said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. He challenges all of Israel. He says, you're champion against me. Fight to the death. Whoever wins, whoever survives, you just get the nation. So if I survive, then the people of Israel, they will become our slaves. If you somehow beat me, great. My nation will become slaves of yours. No one else has to die. One death, the war's over. Really, when you think about it, it's actually sort of a kind offer from Goliath. The problem is, it's an offer he knows nobody wants. I mean, under normal circumstances, if like any other warrior from any other place would have made that offer, Israel has a champion. They have a warrior, a big, strong guy named Saul, who is their king, and also, this commander and this incredible military tactician who's won all of these different battles, a big, strong, tough guy who normally does not back down from a fight. But I mean, even if he's like, fairly large, Goliath's going to be like 3 feet bigger than him and probably have, 300-400 pounds on him. And that's even if he's a big guy. So Saul wants no part of this fight, even though it was really his fight to fight. And so Saul decides to do something else. He says, okay, I'm going to put out a giant reward, the biggest reward anybody's ever heard, if any person from Israel is willing to take this fight. And that is how we have a 40-day stalemate, because there was not a reward big enough to make anyone want to fight this Goliath guy. And so Goliath, day after day, just keeps challenging the people of Israel. He keeps getting more and more frustrated, more and more hostile, more and more angry, more and more insulting, more and more, attacking of the people of Israel and the people of Israel's God. And so for 40 days, that's what happens. And that's when we enter in. You guys already know it's David. Yeah, David. David's a little boy. He's not an adult, at least. I don't know, he's a little boy, but he's not an adult. He's already been anointed as the king, but nobody knows it. So everybody else just looks at him as a normal guy. Samuel has already said, nope, God has chosen him. David is, aware of it, but not really anybody else. And so David, he is only here because he's got food for his brothers who are part of the Israelite army. And he looks and he sees one, he goes out, he takes them food, he sees this guy, and he's like, there's a huge dude who's just insulting everybody. Why is no one fighting him? And of course they're like, well, look at him, that's why. And that's when one of the more interesting things in this story that I'm not sure we realize happens. Okay? This fascinating story, we always think about it as, David having this great faith, and he does. David does absolutely cite his faith in God as a piece of why he's willing to fight Goliath. But most of why he says he's willing to fight Goliath is strategic. He goes to Saul, he's like, you see that guy who's huge? Big guys aren't so fast. Okay, I'm quick. I'm a shepherd. I have to protect my flocks all day against all sorts of various enemies. And you know who the easiest ones are? The giant ones. Lions and bears show up. They're not fast. I can handle them. I know how to kill a bear. I can kill that guy. No problem. I mean, he's confident. I mean, some of it, he says, well, God protects me. I mean, some of it is faith, but most of it is just, when he looks at Goliath, he just sees a big dumb animal, and he can take care of big dumb animals. And so he tells Saul, this is what I want to do. And Saul, who, by the way, can we just say, what a terrible decision by Saul. Send the kid in. Like, if we're watching Star Wars, it makes sense because we know that Anakin is going to be Vader later, right? But, Saul doesn't have that. He has no idea. And Saul's just like, well, I don't want to fight him. I guess I'll let the kid. And then he's like, well, here's some armor. And the kid's like, whoa, I don't want armor. Don't give me, a shield or a sword. I don't want that. Give me a slingshot and some rocks. Let me do that. And Saul, again, second bad decision of the day, is like, yeah, okay, that's cool. Great. It makes no sense. Of course, we know it ends well, but that doesn't change the fact that it was a bad process by Saul. So I don't know if do you guys know who wins? Fight? Anybody know? Okay. So we know that. But there's something in this story that is, once it was pointed out to me a few years ago, is always fascinating to me about this story, okay? There's something here that we need to see. It's again, after you know who David becomes and what David is, it's amazing to see the seeds of who David becomes in his most famous story. So this is what we read in 1 Samuel. This is David talking to Goliath. This is his claim. He says, you come to me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. He says, everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, this is big here, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us. Now, I don't know if he's just talking here or not. Like, maybe he's just, just mouthing off, really. Maybe he's just trying to, enrage Goliath. But his claim is, I'm going to beat you without using a sword. So let's read what he does. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurls it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. That's the part we all remember. The stone sank in and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. Again, we remember that. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. Thank you, writer of 1 Samuel. Then David ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath. David used it to kill him and cut off his head. Now listen. The rock that he puts into his forehead, like that had to hurt, right? I am sure that Goliath was concussed. Positive. But this was not a battle to the concussion. It was a battle of the death. And I'm not trying to argue with the writer of 1 Samuel here. I'm really not. I'm going to. But, he claimed, well, David beat him without a sword. But then your next sentence, writer of 1 Samuel, tells me he didn't. Because again, the fight's not over till somebody's dead. Goliath is still very much alive until David uses a sword. So to review, the story of David and Goliath goes like this. David claims, I don't need a sword to kill you, and then uses a sword to kill him. And by the way, I'm not giving David grief here, okay? It's hard to kill a 9'9", 700-pound man with a rock. Like, it just is. Like, I understand. But it's also, I think, it's just the most human thing. I trust that God can do it without a sword. I believe that God will do it without a sword. And push comes to shove, and he sees a sword, and he says, well, that looks nice. Maybe I'll just use that a little bit for the killing part. I believe, but help my unbelief. Guys, we are one giant walking contradiction when it comes to our belief in God. All of us. All of us. David is a man after God's own heart. David's a good guy. Yeah, okay, we've got the mistakes, right? Like, we know all those. But David, this is a great victory for David. And even in the middle of it, he's showing his conflict. The conflict within him to say, I will trust God, God's, plan for this, or I will trust the way I want to do it. Out in the field, he doesn't have a sword. Remember, he compares Goliath to a bear that he would, or a lion that he would protect his flock from. He doesn't have a sword to do that. He has a plan going in that only involves the sling and the rock, which is why he says, I don't need a sword. God gives a victory without a sword. But man, was that sword enticing. And that's just us. Following Jesus is hard. Even if we get it 90% right, that 10%, even if we get it 95%, that 5%, if we get it 99%, that 1%, it's so hard. It's so hard. So what do we do? Well, I'll tell you what we do. This is what we read in the New Testament letter written by a guy named James. He says, as the scriptures say, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humble yourself before God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. God opposes the proud. Which is to say this, God never expects you to be without conflict. God never expects you to do anything other than ask, help my unbelief. Because God knows that you want to pick up the sword every bit as much as David does. God doesn't expect you to be anything other than who you are, which is why we need grace. If we could be saved, if we could know God without grace, I imagine we'd do it. But we need grace to be saved. We need grace to know God. And God gives grace to the humble. It seems like a weird roundabout way to get there. But when I think about the story of David and Goliath, I'm reminded to be humble. Because if that's how David did it, oh man, how would I do it? I would have been way worse at that. And so this morning, as we are in our 6th week of our series called Children's Church for Adults, as we look at these old stories, there's an incredibly hopeful and convicting and hopefully humbling message we need to hear. Our 6th lesson from Children's Church for Adults is this: we all struggle to believe, but when we are humble, God's grace gives us strength. We all struggle to believe, but when we are humble, God's grace gives us strength. James is going to come up here. We're going to sing a song. We offer an invitation. You guys know what that invitation is. No one in here, you're not showing up on the first day after we haven't had church in 10 weeks and are unaware of how things work. So, if you guys need to talk, you let me know. But as we move forward, we need to move forward simply understanding who we are. We are people with conflict. We are people who struggle. But we are people who serve a God who gets it, who understands, who loves us, and is there for us anyway. God opposes absolutely some behaviors and some people. If we are proud and we say, I don't need this, okay. But if we can say, I need grace, God is always there for us. As we stand,